Ammar, let me ask, if in some way, shape, or form Assad does go, this issue of the fracturing of the state, whether the Alawites are able to establish some kind of rump state in the north west, and the Kurds, as you say, are more or less in control of territory now in the northeast, and quite, I'd say, in some ways alienated and disaffected from the rebellion in the wider part of the country, and with its obvious Sunni Arab subtext. Given how far things have gone, do you see that now, if Assad were to go, as the most likely outcome, this kind of chaotic fracturing? And are there things that you believe at this point in time we can do to reverse the clock?
Even with Assad staying in power, this is happening. The fracturing is now real. We are going back to a pristine condition, if this is the right way to describe it. But regions and regional realities have really become very visible, and they are imposing themselves on the scene. You know, the realities in Aleppo are not the same as those in Dar'a in the south, are not the same as those in Deir ez-Zor. And I think when I monitor the rhetoric that's in the statements and the chatter that happen in social media, you can see that regional identity is being solidified, and people are, there is an overarching Syrian identity. I'm not saying that everybody wants to break out from Syria. In fact, even the Kurds are not using sort of the separatist language, like we want to sort of declare our independence, whatever. There is an overarching belonging to Syria, but everybody also is saying other things that, when you look at the practical interpretations, it means we want a better deal than we used to have under the Ba'ath regime. That better deal, to me, indicates a desire for some kind of a local autonomy, not just simply a decentralization, but as a very strong local form of governance. And when you add that to the fact that already there are rebel groups that are disunited and that are acquiring a revolutionary legitimacy even in their own minds, and this is the key. It's not just in the minds of the people, but in their own minds they feel they're entitled. We are dying, we're risking, you know, what's in it for us now? Are we going to be shoved aside and sort of told, okay, now go back and be nobodies? You know, it's just not going to happen. So the reality is, the fracturing is here, and it's going to stay for a while, and the challenge that's facing opposition groups inside and outside the country is to come up with this vision for Syria. I mean, David said about the transitional justice vision. We need an overarching political vision of what a new Syria is going to look like. We've been trying for a while in our discussion in the opposition, and you know that recently there were some series of workshops that we've had here for opposition groups, and FDD helped, in fact, help us get and come together here to do it. And the concept of decentralization, just the vague concept, is still something that a lot of them are seeing an anathematic. And even though when we explain and we talk about the realities on the ground, there's still this cut-off, there's this inability to transcend their own ideologies and think about what realities are unfolding and how they need to manage it. Instead of looking at their role as potential managers of a different situation, trying to create something new, they still think that they are going to inherit the state as it is under Assad, with some minor, issues of transitional justice and putting the economy back together and whatever. The idea that they need to put the state back together is not there yet. It's not just reconstruction. It's not just the new buildings that need to be established, but it's putting the state back together. It's actually asking different people in different regions, what are your real aspirations, and how do you envision your role in the future Syria, and all of these issues. These are still discussions that we are not having in the opposition, or that are proven to be very difficult to even broach. So I think for this reason, the intervention is going to be difficult. And I think for this reason, we need an intervention. Because unless you think that a chaotic situation in Syria is okay, and we can live with it, then you'll need to do something to prevent that chaos from becoming a reality, because it's fast becoming a reality. So have we reached this point of no return? Is it just going to happen? I think we're very much near it. And if you are going to wait until November, perhaps by that time, yeah, we will have reached the point of no return. We need to do something now. One of the frustration things that I've been having, my own frustration, is that everything that we're talking about today is something that probably after 2 months of the revolution that we've been actually saying and predicting. This is going to happen. If you wait, this is going to happen. You're going to have massacres. You're going to have ethnic cleansing. You're going to risk partition in the country. So it's not something that no one predicted. It was predictable, and we talked about it, and we warned against it, and yet we saw no action. So in a sense, it seems to me that there is a tendency among some of the political establishment, or a willingness to accept a fragmentation of Syria and to live with it, and to think that this is somehow manageable, and if that's what's going to happen, then that's what's going to happen.
Let me pursue that a bit with Reuel, because I'm obviously sympathetic to what Reuel and Ammar have to say, and it's been frustrating to watch an American administration kind of hide behind the fig leaf of diplomatic processes and Security Council meetings and international conferences, all of them seemingly completely divorced from the reality of what's happening on the ground in Syria, and all the more putting a veto, essentially, in the hands of the likes of Vladimir Putin over a moral tragedy like this that more importantly touches, or appears to touch, vital American interests, not the least the struggle with the Iranians. Now, having said that, however, and whatever our predispositions, I mean, the alternative argument, I suppose the president's supporters could say, is look at what's happened. Without a single American soldier, airplane put at risk, lots of words, very little action, a little bit of logistical support maybe. We've got this amazing story that virtually on their own, the Syrian people have struggled and brought this regime possibly to the cusp of defeat, that they are able on their own to get inside of the inner sanctum and blow parts of it to kingdom come, and have this regime in a sense on the run. And as bad as it is, as much of a humanitarian disaster, as many people have died as they have, this is all coming around. The president said this guy was going to go 11 months ago, and lo and behold, that may indeed happen still, with very little American effort or risk. The risk-reward ratio at the moment, I suppose one could argue, looks quite good, and even looks better than what happened in Libya. So I wonder, Reuel, if you're sitting with the president and you hear this kind of argument, how do you persuade him otherwise? Not to mention that the course that he's been on is entirely in keeping with where I believe the majority of the American people, in fact, are, who are really war-weary and fed up with Middle Eastern problems and completely consumed with our own difficulties here at home. So what's the case you make to the president?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't think you actually at this time probably could make a compelling case to him. I think it's really the narrative right now that you just outlined is a narrative that appeals to him, obviously. It's a narrative that appeals to lots of Republicans up on the Hill. I mean, you would want him, I think, to sort of display the insight and fortitude that, say, George W. Bush had when he launched the surge, and where in his most inner circle, almost everybody except him was against it. But I don't think you will. I think the only way the narrative changes is if the fall of Assad doesn't happen, and that what you do see is not 20,000 people dead, but 100,000 people dead. I think every 10,000 increment of slaughter, you might say, diminishes that narrative. So I don't know where that line is where suddenly that's not a narrative that you want to strut out anymore. But I suspect, it's somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people are dead. So wherever that line is, I think that's where you're no longer going to use it. And now you could still use the argument, and you hear that argument more often, I think, on the Republican side, which is sort of just let them all slaughter each other. Without a great consideration of the strategic calculations of the Middle East, because it's sort of like the Middle East, go away, just go away. So I think that is also pretty powerful. Again, I would emphasize, I think if you had to right now put your finger on something that will change the dynamic here, that has to be Turkey. I think President Obama is out of this one. Unless you see something happen in Turkey, or if you just see the slaughter accelerate at such a rate that we are more or less obliged to do something. It's possible that if the FSA could get a hold of Aleppo and declare it a free city and set up an opposition government in Aleppo and could figure out some way how to stop the armor, the artillery, the planes from coming and driving them out, at least for a while, that you could rapidly change the dynamic, and it would certainly be an interesting game then with Turkey, if the FSA can do it. I don't think they have the wherewithal to do that now, but if something like that were to occur, then you could get mutatis mutandis a Benghazi scenario that would have, I think, a lot of traction in Turkey and might even be a compelling argument in Washington.
David, can I just get you, before we go to the audience, your quick thoughts on this issue of how susceptible the current conflict is to some kind of outside intervention that would actually have a positive shaping influence both on where this conflict goes in the immediate period ahead and what might come after that?
Well, I think a number of the people, the rebels anyway, I mean, what we've seen is them sort of give up on international intervention. And I think that's been the key dynamic in the last 6 months, is they've just decided that they have to go it alone one way or the other. And they've done that, and they've created networks. And I think Turkish intelligence maybe could be a little more involved than we're getting. There is some evidence and talk of that. And they've managed to secure, I mean, certainly light weapons, and I mean, they have a regular flow of weapons now. They do not seem to have money issues, and I think, the trajectory is that eventually they will take down the government or force it into some sort of Alawi enclave. Intervention, I mean, are we talking about if we're talking about just bombing, taking out defenses, do we want to be responsible for what will probably be the likely ensuing massacre of the Alawite minority, or the driving out of the Alawite minority? What will fill that power vacuum? I mean, there's obviously at this point a vacuum we're moving toward a total vacuum, and I think after the government falls, that could be even more serious. I don't necessarily see an intervention that prevents these things. Possibly lessening the overall death toll by taking away the government's ability to use these heavy weapons. But other than that, I think all of the dynamics that we're talking about still exist, even if we're involved or not. And then you also have the issue of, what we just saw in Libya. What happens when we dump a bunch of weapons on a country? If that's the way we go about it, then what happens? Where do these weapons go? Do they fall into the hands of Islamist fighters who are then going to attack our allies in Jordan? So I don't know that there is a clean intervention in any sense of the word. And I think a lot of Syrians, I mean, increasingly you hear the rebels say, we don't want NATO. We're going to do it ourselves, and we'll be better off because we've done it ourselves.
Okay, good. Ammar, yeah, please, quick.
There is an interesting issue here, because how do you define victory in this situation? That's basically the important thing. If you define victory as forcing Assad into an Alawite enclave or killing him, forcing him out of the country, if that's victory enough for you, then probably you shouldn't do anything about it. Just perhaps little weapons and you know, to ensure that the current clashes intensify and force the Assad to do something along these lines, to leave or to go to an Alawite enclave. If that's your definition of victory, then what's happening is already a good thing. But if your definition of victory is creating a stable country, and now it's getting very difficult, as I said, to achieve that. It requires a lot of micromanagement and finessing. But if that's your definition of victory, then you cannot stand on the sidelines. And you cannot simply watch from the sidelines and say, you know, this is acceptable and what's happening is exactly what should be happening. We need to, many people said the opposition did not have a strategy, but actually months ago we came up with our own 6-point plans. And we spoke about targeted airstrikes. We don't want an entire military campaign on Libya, but targeted airstrikes, some weapons to the revolutionaries. In fact, we don't even want a lot of sophisticated weaponry, exactly because you don't want to create a situation of militias being too heavily armed, because that will only complicate the political transitional process. But when you couple it with airstrikes and weapons, and when you introduce peacekeepers into the formula and actually allow peacekeepers to go into certain sensitive areas to create a separation of forces, then you are really alleviating all of the concerns. And the problem is that you're facing is not that this plan is not realistic or practical or does not remedy the situation. It does, but the problem is there is no international rule whatsoever to be involved. So we are dealing with an international community that really wants to do nothing about a conflict, but at the same time it wants the conflict to somehow resolve itself in the right way. You know, so that we don't have to worry about the solution of a country. We don't have to worry about massacres taking place. We don't have to worry about Islamists being empowered. We don't have. So we have a list of a wish list that's very, very long, but we are not willing to do anything to get any of these wishes come true. And this is where you know, the dilemma we're facing. But knowing what the solution is, we have known it months ago, and indeed what kind of intervention needed. And it's really an intervention that's doable, that's affordable. It's not as risque, especially if you have sort of enacted it months ago. It would have been even easier. But there is no other way around it if you want stability to be an outcome in Syria. But if you don't care about stability in Syria, if you can live with chaos, then I think that all you have to do is watch and enjoy the show.
Okay, let's turn it over to the audience. People just identify themselves to me, and then identify yourselves, please, for the rest of the audience. First, Cliff May in the front row.
On the face of it, Turkey's position seems ambivalent and perhaps incoherent. Now, if you speak to Turkish diplomats off the record, as I have in recent days, you then come to the conclusion that Turkey's position is ambivalent and perhaps incoherent. And I'd love you to try to explain what their calculation is. And anybody, but I know Ammar looks at this, and I know you have a long experience, Reuel, in Turkey.
You know, quickly just to say that I think ambivalent is exactly it. I mean, they are afraid of the Kurdish issue. That is one important situation for them. Also, I think there is a point of view that's in the Turkish establishment, especially among Erdogan's people, that what's happening is a normal process. People are rediscovering their identity. They will decide on their identity issues by themselves. On the other hand, Turkey wants to do enough to ensure that the instability doesn't pour into Turkish areas, and I think that's why they were behind the Holer agreement or the Erbil agreement that happened between the Kurdish factions. They want to ensure that the Kurds, in fact, control all of this border with Turkey, and achieve an autonomy. Strangely enough, they are very pragmatic about the Kurdish questions, exactly like they were pragmatic in Iraqi Kurdistan. Now they are very friendly to Barzani. They found there is an advantage to have a stable partner, basically, in Iraq, and that is Iraqi Kurdistan. And I think they see a similar scenario happening basically in the Kurdish enclaves across the border in Syria. So for them, as long as they can create that outcome and perhaps some support, whether it's intelligence or allowing for the arms smuggling to happen, to ensure that at least the FSA is getting enough weapons to take it to the Assads, then they are happy with that kind of an outcome. I don't think that they want to intervene. I don't think they want to be dragged into even having airstrikes, especially considering the Obama position. I mean, the idea that you have to drag him by the nose for him to lead from behind is not something that the Turks are going to do.
Reuel, did you want a brief comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think there's the added component is that, in Kemalist Turkey, and that mindset has permeated even into the AKP with the Islamist crowd, is that, the Arabs are just bad news. They're an innervating factor. They were the weak part of the Ottoman Empire. The whole thrust of Turkish foreign policy was to sort of stay away from them. Obviously, the AKP has tried to change that to some extent, but still, it's there. It's in the body politic, and it's certainly, inside of the military. And needless to say, Erdogan and the Turkish military do not have a very happy relationship. So you add on the troubles between the civilian government and the Turkish military, which is under siege. The military has no desire whatsoever to go in there. The Arabs are always bad news. And it's extremely difficult, I think, to get the Turks to go there. That you can get, MIT, the Turkish intelligence and service, to do a bit more, I think, is doable. They have been doing it, but again, it's not their bailiwick. And the Turks haven't had really pleasant experiences when they've tried to project power. The invasion of Cyprus, which is a great victory, of course, was a logistical mess. So. There is. They really don't want to go there, but I still think it is conceivable. If you look at where Turkish rhetoric, Turkish actions are now, backdated 12 months, it's quite a difference actually. So change is still possible.
Gaith Al-Ammari. Please identify yourself, Gaith.
Thanks, John. Gaith Al-Ammari from the American Task Force in Palestine. I want to remain on the regional theme and ask about two countries that were briefly mentioned. One is Jordan. I assume that Jordan is worried about either the chaos fragmentation scenario or the Islamization scenario. So what can Jordan do? And what do you expect it to do if things continue in this current trajectory? The second one is Qatar, in the context of the Islamization that Ammar talked about. I mean, we've seen Qatar in other Arab countries really pushing an Islamist agenda, a Muslim Brotherhood agenda. Are they doing something similar? What are they doing in Syria? What is the Qatari influence in that game? Thanks.
Well, I mean, for me, I would like very much to see Jordan being more hospitable to the refugees to begin with. They have not been as hospitable as Turkey. There are problems in this area, and I hope that they can resolve it soon. I know Jordanian officials may not like to be reminded publicly of that, but that's an issue they should be reminded of anyway. That's my job as an activist, is to tell them you're not doing a good job being hospitable to your fellow Syrians at this stage. The other thing, however, that's happening is that they seem to be not to realize that they can be easily dragged into a conflict across the border. I mean, yesterday there were talks about clashes between the Jordanian and the Syrian armies on the border. I cannot confirm it, no one can confirm it so far, but I wouldn't discount that, it happened across the border with Turkey, it could happen across the border with Jordan. As more refugees flee and loyalist militias try to stop them, they, easily, the Jordanians might find themselves in a position where they have to respond. So the problem is, the more the situation therefore devolves in Syria, especially in the southern parts, the more likely that some scenario like that is going to happen. So I think the Jordanians should begin to think about ways to actually reach out to across the border and begin working on transitional arrangements of their own, very much like the Turkish have done. Perhaps it's, if they can identify suitable partners among the local resistance, they might be able to pacify, therefore, Daraa. and make sure that it's stable and friendly, and that moderate elements are in charge of the local government. So that's one thing the Jordanians can do, and this is a positive step, in my opinion, if they adopt that mindset. As far as your second question on the Islamization, I also don't want to sound the alarm too much. It's happening, but I'm not saying it's the trend. It's a trend among trends. But it is getting support. There is financial support. It is coming from somewhere. But it's not necessarily coming from the Qatari government per se or the Saudi government, but individuals are doing it. And this is, and this is problematic in itself. And it's not about the Brotherhood. I think the Brotherhood, as far as the movement is concerned, is the more moderate among the Islamic factions that are appearing. So in fact, the Brotherhood could play a moderating role now. We are talking about people far to the right of the Brotherhood when we talk about Islamization that we are afraid of. So the Brotherhood Islamization has been enshrined in a doctrine that they have reiterated repeatedly about civil states, respect for minority rights, and I think this is a good step. We still need more guarantees, whether they are sincere or not. It's not something we have to talk about. Therefore, the actual structure of the state and how things should be phrased, and not blindly trust anyone. So they still have a distance to go, and they still need to be tested. But my worries is about those groups that are not affiliated with any movement that you can actually interact with. The Brotherhood is there, they have structure, you can interact with it. The other movements, they're new, they're current, they're now basically becoming aware of themselves, and you don't know. Hizb ut-Tahrir is going to be, for instance, a very problematic aspect in Syria, because already they have created cantons in different parts of rural Damascus and Aleppo, and their attitude in terms of cooperating with other groups wasn't really very positive. So apparently, and they are calling openly for an Islamic state. Even Salafi groups are not calling for an Islamic state. Only Hizb ut-Tahrir right now that I know of that's calling strictly and directly for an Islamic state. Their membership is too limited for them to be a serious threat in that regard, but they could be on a local level problematic. And this is what you have to think of in terms of Syria. It's not the national scene. On the national scene, we're all minorities. Every political movement, every group, every region, we're all minorities right now. Because there is no Sunni identity, it's a regional identity. There are the Sunnis of the Deir, the Sunnis of Dara, the Sunni of the, and then there are the political divisions. So we are all minorities. But because of the fragmentation that's happening right now, having a group like Hizb ut-Tahrir in areas in Damascus foreign for an Islamic state is going to create a problem, because they control a certain area and they won't give it up if that's their ideology. So no one is saying, and I do not envision that the transition is going to be easy, but at the same time, I don't envision necessarily that all of these groups are going to begin fighting against each other, especially if there is a political vision, a guiding, if there is an international will to somehow manage the situation and empower the dialogue between these different groups. But we continue to see a hands-off policy in this regard, and this is troubling.
Hussein.
Could I just speak to Jordan for a moment? I think Jordan's been slowly pushed into becoming more supportive. Obviously, I think the majority of Jordanians are very supportive of the revolution. I spent a couple weeks in March trying to get across the Jordanian border to Dara with a group of Salafi fighters who were being funded by at least individual donations from the Gulf. They were not able to get across in March. The Jordanians weren't letting anything across, although they were apparently occasionally engaging in some skirmishes with the Syrian military, apparently to cover refugees who were fleeing. The Jordanians would apparently engage Syrian soldiers who were attacking people who were fleeing into Jordan. As far as aid for refugees, I think there are probably a lot of Iraqis who feel, we're seeing essentially, as far as Jordan and the refugee situation is concerned, more or less a replay where for the first year of the conflict they were open and supportive and taking the refugees who were bringing money. And when we've reached the point where people are fleeing with virtually nothing because they're forced to, the Jordanians have quietly sort of shut down their borders and hopefully activists will be able to convince them otherwise, but Iraqis seem to have very, very little success in doing that. Jordanians that I speak to, politicians and businessmen, largely saw the tipping point for Jordan being when Syria was no longer viable as a trade route or as an economic partner, when they were losing more economically by not coming out against Assad than they were gaining. And I think we're probably, as Syria continues to sort of fragment and fall apart, we've probably reached that point with Jordan. I mean, now it does seem that they are at least allowing fighters to cross the border again with weapons, with other supplies into Dara.
Okay, thanks. Let's go to Hussein, and then we'll take, if there are a couple of other questions, we'll take three at once.
Hussein Abu Hussein, a journalist. David, doing what you do when you're in Beirut, do you feel safe, or do you feel the company of people like Hezbollah or maybe the Lebanese friends of Assad?
Okay, let's get right here, behind us. Please identify yourself.
My name is Casey. My name is Casey Krolchak. I'm from the American Friends of UNRWA. And I was wondering, Mr. Ender mentioned that refugee camps in Syria, or sorry, not in Syria, in Turkey are being used as a staging ground for rebel groups. And I'm wondering if the panel had any recommendations as to how we can protect the integrity of those camps as spaces for protection and humanitarian aid rather than active variables in the conflict.
Another one in the back here, this gentleman.
Dana Stuster, Center for New American Security. I've heard some concerns about
louder.
I've heard some concerns about the command and control capabilities of the rebel groups in, trying to coordinate through YouTube and calling into startup radio and television stations. In the past couple of weeks, though, it seems that they've been remarkably coordinated, especially with the assaults on Damascus. Has something changed? And what is your impression of their command and control capabilities at this point?
David, do you want to start off?
I can. Do you want me to take all three of those?
Well, at least the first and the last one.
Okay. As far as Hezbollah, in the border areas, when you're crossing from Lebanon to Syria, there's talk about Hezbollah fighters patrolling those areas. But inside Beirut, inside Tripoli, inside Lebanon in general, at least as a foreign correspondent, I feel safe. There were some reports maybe 5 months ago, of the Syrian embassy threatening journalists, but nothing like that seems to have happened since then. As far as preventing the camps from becoming staging grounds, I mean, there are Turkish soldiers stationed at these camps searching bags, but I think as long as you allow, Syrians to come into Turkey, they're going to be planning, they're going to be using these areas. I mean, the Turks are patrolling the border very heavily. I think to some extent there's just such a volume that it's very hard to do anything about it without dedicating a lot more manpower than I think they're willing to right now to making sure these camps aren't used that way. And the third question was...
What's this question about command and control?
Command and control.
Improvements that have occurred over the past several weeks.
So the rebels have at least 3 TV stations that broadcast on satellite. One of which is very slickly produced. Obviously has a lot of support, and we do see. I mean, Skype is become a major tool of the revolutionaries. I mean, they do have satellite internet in a lot of places, and they do use Skype to coordinate things. I think probably their ability to communicate and their communications infrastructure, just out of necessity, has gotten better. And they are coalescing under command in larger areas. I mean, we are seeing them unite ever larger groups of rebels, sometimes loosely, sometimes somewhat strictly. And I think that's just a natural development.
I think it's also correct to say I think the CIA and the Turks have delivered encrypted radio equipment. So.
Okay, can we get any final?
I think there was a question on the refugees and how to protect the integrity of the refugee camps.
In Turkey.
Yeah, in Turkey. David, you might correct me on this. Not most of the planning that's happen in Antakya, where some of the refugee camps exists, but not necessarily in the camps themselves. There's only one camp where the military officers exist, so they do take part in some planning. But the other refugee camps, as far as I know, where civilians are there, people might they have a lot of limitations on their movements anyway, so they cannot therefore really take an active part in planning operations. But if you're talking about areas outside the camp, the sort of unofficial refugees who are there but they are not in the camps, then yeah, I mean this is. But I don't really see a problem for the integrity of the refugee camps that they are being used as operational centers. That's not my impression. But then, David, you are there. You can speak more.
No, I wouldn't say operational centers. It's much less formal. There are areas around the camps where there are lots of fighters. There are also just young men sharing information inside the camps, how to build a bomb, how to do this, how to do that. And, I mean, it kind of turned into a joke. Journalists weren't allowed to go into the camp, and we were sitting there looking, and there were Turkish soldiers stationed at the entrance to the camp, and then a few hundred meters away there was a big hole in the fence where people were just coming and going freely. So that sort of gave us an idea of maybe how tight the control really was.
Have we got any final questions? Last couple of minutes we have. Let me just quickly ask, if there aren't, ask Reuel and Ammar about a country that hasn't been mentioned, which is Israel, and particularly in the context of potential use or going loose of chemical weapons. What do you think the Israeli calculations are now? Do you foresee any possibility in which the Israelis would have to get involved in this conflict?
I don't think the Israelis would want to get involved in this. I don't think they have any great desire. I do think, obviously, the chemical weapons and biological weapons, if they're there, would be a significant factor for them, and they would try to watch that very closely. I don't know what the Israeli network is inside of Syria. I suspect it's very haphazard. So their ability to collect intelligence on this that is not technical is probably somewhat limited. But I don't see. I suppose that they might decide to deliver weaponry, and there's certainly Syrian groups who would take that weaponry. But I suspect that they see their role right now as largely that of an observer.
Good. Ammar, have you got any thoughts? Yeah. Okay. We've reached 11 o'clock. Please, everybody, join me in thanking the panelists for what was a terrific discussion.